in Chichester, which houses the finest collection of British and modern art outside of Britain. He's a highly respected art historian and curator who's written books or catalogues and or curated exhibitions on lots of artists, including Edward Barra, Eduardo Paolozzi, Colin Self and Leon Underwood. The theme subjects for his work have included Spanish artists in the British Civil War and classicism in British art, 1920 to 1940. Simon's also been involved with our project from the outset, and today he's going to explore the individualist artist, Gluck and modern British art. Thank you, and I should turn the lights off.
Okay. So, Gluck. There can be few figures in the history of modern British art really as singular as Gluck. As discussed by the others earlier, the artist insisted on being referred to as just Gluck, no prefix, no suffix or quotes. Press reviews of Gluck's exhibitions give as much attention to the distinctive masculine dress worn by the artist at private views as to the beauty of the paintings on display. Gluck's life and work belie any attempts at easy categorization, consistently raising questions about identity and belonging. Gluck is celebrated for striking paintings of floral arrangements such as this. This is chromatic on the left. But through resolute denial of femininity, the artist resists being pigeonholed within the pantheon of 20th century women artists. From a Jewish cultural background, yet none of the artist's oeuvre could be interpreted as expressing this heritage. Gluck painted poignant and powerful self-portraits and depicted close female friends and lovers, but any sense of Gluck's sexuality is evasive. Independently minded in art as in life, Gluck consciously avoided joining any artistic groups, instead always remaining on the outside. Coming from the affluent Gluckstein family, who had formed J. Lyons and Company, known for its tea shops, corner houses, restaurants, hotels, and food distribution, Gluck was not an outsider through lack of opportunity or training, but made a conscious effort and choice to differentiate not just from what was known as the family, but also from any other alternative artistic community, neither joining any of the succession of avant-garde groups in Britain, such as the 7 and 5 Society, Unit 1, or the Surrealists. Neither did Gluck aspire to become part of the traditional artistic establishment through joining the Royal Academy, for example, or becoming a member of any of the other more conservative artist groups. How then do we position Gluck within the narratives and movements of 20th century British art? The originality of Gluck's paintings was frequently noted by art commentators. Reviewing the artist's first solo exhibition at the Fine Arts Society in April 1926, the art critic of the Art News observed that a less derivative style I have not seen for many a long day. Unlike many contemporaries, there is no discernible influence of cubism, vorticism, abstraction, and the artist was to deny any other stylistic affinity. In response that the work was a manifestation of Art Deco, Gluck wrote to John Morley, the director of Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, asserting that certainly I have never consciously belonged to any movement, as the credo set out in my catalogue in the 1973 exhibition says, I paint whatever makes me tick. Gluck claimed that whilst the 1926 painting The Three Nifty Gnats, seen here, depicted an Art Deco stage decoration, none of, I quote here, my other paintings had that hallmark, but maybe they do without realising it. I suppose it's quite impossible in such circumstances not to have a tinge of the period in which one paints one's paintings. Though always having been a very timeless person, I suppose it simply proves that I am recording the movement of life as it changes from one decade to the next. Rather than seeing Gluck's paintings as timeless, considering how the artist reflects the tinge of the period, to quote, is perhaps the most instructive way of approaching the artist's work. For although not a joiner, Gluck was in the orbit of some of the most significant British artists and designers of the 20th century. Typically, Gluck denied any impact from studies at the St John's Wood School of Art in the mid-1910s, when still known as Miss Hannah Gluckstein, declaring, "As far as I was concerned, there was nothing taught that could be considered training." Numerous British artists studied at the St John's Wood School, usually as a precursor to the Slade or the Royal College of Art, but compared to the former institution, it was conventional in outlook, offering training in painting, composition, anatomy, perspective, mural painting, and commercial art. Given Gluck's later obsession with the materials of paint and what were described as Gluck's paint wars, if nothing else, it would have provided a grounding in the painter's craft. One of Gluck's earliest known paintings is The Artist's Grandfather, painted in 1915, and it gives an indication of a really remarkable facility with paint. The handling of his mutton chop whiskers suggests that Gluck had been looking at portraits by artists such as William Nicholson and John Singer Sargent. This is his portrait of Rodin, which were characterised by dark backgrounds and bravura paint techniques. Such skills clearly attracted the attention of Gordon Selfridge, who provided a room in his department store in which Gluck was to produce instant portraits. But as might be expected, the artist did not do this for fear of becoming slick. Perhaps Gluck's most formative experience was the 1916 trip with a friend and fellow student, Craig, who also just used her surname, to Lamorna, a Cornish seaside village. This is actually a shot taken from the film Summer in Spring, or whatever it's called. I can't remember what it's called. About the Lamorna community of artists. A Cornish seaside village which had become home to an artists' colony in the late 19th century. Gluck later observed that it was a wonderful month, my first meeting with genuine artists, during which Gluck was drawn by Munnings, as we saw earlier in Amy's presentation. For an artist so preoccupied with singularity and individualism, it is fascinating that Gluck should have produced a number of paintings of crowd scenes in the 1920s and 30s, such as The Jockey. I apologise for the terrible picture here, which I photographed from a book. Gluck's choice of racing crowds as a subject was perhaps partly due to the influence of Munnings, who did the previous drawing, and who, of course, was passionate about riding and horse race scenes. But these paintings that she did, I've just said she when I was trying not to, I apologise, that Gluck did, show an awareness of the horse paintings of the Camden Town painter Robert Bevan. Here's an example here from the mid-20s. Yet, unlike Bevan and Munnings, Gluck evidently had no interest in painting the horses competing at such events, but rather the shape and makeup of the crowd. In The Jockey, the eponymous subject, appears in profile against the sky above a mass of people. It's unclear whether his lofty position is the result of sitting on a horse that is hidden from view, or actually that he's being held on the shoulders of the crowd. Compared with the anonymity of the kind of matchstick figures by L.S. Lowry, Gluck's monochrome crowds have a stylized realism. Yet the figures remain indeterminate. This seems to be the crucial fact here. In the crowd scenes of Bevan, for example, the men are clearly identifiable as male, and the women can be easily identified as female by their outfits. Yet in Gluck's paintings, it's difficult to tell whether some of the figures are men or women, particularly in the case of one figure on the edge of the group, which is here, whose face is obscured by a hat pulled low and whose dress is boyish, but whose body language and gait is very subtly different, as if it is a woman in riding slacks, not dissimilar to the new woman outfit in which Gluck is depicted with the artist Ella Naper in Bonfire, which is now destroyed. One wonders if there's any possibility of autobiography about such a work, Gluck introducing a form of self-portrait into the picture. By note, it's rather interesting that this Laura Knight is actually of Ella Naper as well, the model, just a kind of tangential point here. In the late 1920s, Gluck painted a series of pictures of boxing matches, such as Baldock versus Bell, the Albert Hall from 1927. Fight scenes are highly unusual in the oeuvre of women artists, and as such, the depiction of a boxing match in itself is perhaps a knowing denial of femininity through the espousal of a masculine subject. The choice of subject matter perhaps reflects the fact that Gluck's close friend, the magazine editor Sybil Cookson, wrote about boxing, and so apparently was able to take Gluck to such events. But even so, the composition was not a record of a scene witnessed, but actually based on a photograph of a floodlit fight between Alex Ireland and Bart Molina, published in the Daily Sketch. So not actually the fighters in the title. The approach to using material from press photographs was something that was actually to characterise the work of Walter Sickert later in the 1930s, and anticipates the use of source material drawn from popular culture by the pop artists in the 1960s. This, for example, is one of Sickert's paintings from the 30s, using a similar approach. Gluck's treatment contrasts with the visceral approach of other artists known for their depictions of boxing scenes, such as the American artist George Bellows, seen here, in the early years of the 20th century. Or, in fact, William Roberts, in his contemporaneous painting, The Boxing Match from 1925 to 27, in which the focus is largely on the violent interaction of the two fighting figures. Gluck's painting is less about the fighters and their bodies, but instead on the theatrical spectacle, the stage lighting on the boxing ring and the effect of illuminating the white shirt of the men in the audience. Yet, although the subject might be expected to be concerned with machismo, the figures of the fighters are curiously gender neutral. This is perhaps symptomatic of Gluck's apparent disinterest in the physicality of the body. Unclothed figures are rare, if almost entirely absent from Gluck's oeuvre, and as far as is known, the artist did not produce any quantity of nude figure studies. All Gluck's clothed figures are invariably wiry, with no apparent concern for the muscle and bones beneath the clothing, as in paintings such as Leonid Massine waiting for his cue to go on stage in On With the Dance from 1925, in which Diaghilev's lover, the former male lead of the Ballet Russe, is seen from behind with his thin waistline and ponytail emphasizing his androgynous appearance. In Ernest Thesiger, the homosexual actor is shown in white tie under the spotlight on the stage of Noel Coward's On and Off the Stage, in which he appeared in drag. These are not by Gluck on the right, but representative images of him. There is a knowing queerness to such subjects, as if Gluck was painting for an audience that might recognise a performative subtext beneath the surface appearance. Arguably, Gluck's images reveal an interest in outline, in the shape of clothes, and how they disguise the body beneath, which is entirely consistent with Gluck's own adoption of masculine clothing. Such gender ambiguity is present in paintings such as Bank Holiday Monday, which depicts a jolly fairground scene with the central protagonist standing legs astride, wearing +4s with bright yellow and blue stripy socks and a jaunty multicoloured scarf. Whilst outwardly the type of clothing that might be worn by a dandyish young man of the period, the brassy yellow hair, and that's clearly artificially dyed, the dark lip colour, and the shapeliness of the eyebrow infer that this is either an effeminate male or a woman in menswear. Whilst one hand grasps a pair of gloves with a forceful grip, the other, holding driving goggles, has a shapely feminine wrist. A smudge of paint serves to subtly emphasise either high cheekbones or blusher, or both. The figure standing closely behind wears sailor's blue bell-bottomed trousers and has a garçon haircut, but appears to have bright red lipstick, and carries a pom-pom with a pink, blue and white ribbons. The implication is that amongst the gaiety and balloons of the fairground, subversion or the flouting of gender norms is possible. Such gender-fluid subject matter is rare in modern British art, although it does occur in the work of male homosexual and bisexual artists such as Christopher Wood and Edward Burrough. In his paintings of the late 20s, for example, Edward Burrough depicted men in drag in numerous works, such as The Common Stare, and this actually is a kind of self-portrait of Edward Burrough, and of course, brothels had a lot of laundry. This is what's going on here. And also Dockside Cafe, Marseille, in which you kind of have, you can see the figures behind the bar. And Burrough himself adopted the alter ego of Lady Amy Bureau in letters to his friends. Gluck's portraits of young men in the decade following the First World War are notably free of any attempt at presenting a heroic view of masculinity. In portraits such as the portrait of the son of Sir Reginald Blomfield, R.A., the sitter's pose and hand gesture introduces an element of vulnerability. Blomfield's son is shown smoking a cigarette in black tie before a stylized abstract background. And here, in George Reeves' Pianist, he's shown side-on with his hands folded in his lap, his face turned towards the viewer. This three-quarter length format and the composition essentially mirror that of a remarkable portrait of Gluck by the American artist Romaine Brooks. It's a kind of mirror copy of it, in which Gluck is depicted in profile before a neutral background. Again, with a garçon haircut, starched white shirt and tie, a long dark coat, with one hand at the waist holding a man's hat. Hand gestures are often the fulcrum on which rests the psychological tension of Gluck's portraits, whether it's the touching fingers of portrait of... That's the automatic image that PowerPoint gives you to... Not a family picture. Portrait of Miss Watts, the bejewelled hand holding a hat in Bettina, or the glamorous outstretched red-painted talons of the Lady Mount Temple. Gluck was to observe how all men's gestures are self-revealing. In some lightning split second, you will see the complete revelation of the person in the pose. You should be aware of this as the spiritually dominating factor from which nothing in your subsequent handling should distract. The vision must pass through the crucible of your spirit. The emotion is on a wavelength that you must be able to tune into at will. Essential characteristics must be assimilated to such a concentrated degree that no accidental change of light or mood can shake you. The divine blindness in your holy of holies which nothing else must enter. However seductive, do not try and see everything. Only put down that is what is essential to the realization of the essence of your sitter. Once you have placed all of this in a large way in your canvas, you can then attend to all the superimposed details which enhance your original vision and give it more depth of characterization. For instance, you might feel that the hands of your sitter were a complement to the point of the head or a contradiction to give them the depth of duality. It is striking that in self-portraits such as Self-Portrait with Cigarettes or Medallion, You, We, or Self-Portrait 1942, Gluck gives little away, as if the absence of gesture enables a stony-faced form of neutrality. With the exception of the fragment kept from the painting destroyed here, Bonfire, in which Gluck is depicted with hands outstretched, all Gluck's self-portraits are cropped to just the head and shoulders. The earlier self-portrait shows the artist in a man's shirt, striped tie and braces. As in the portrait of Reginald Blomfield's son, the decision to record the burning cigarette, something so transitory, is a very particular choice that is central to the way that the portrait is read. Gluck does not hold the cigarette to the mouth in a gesture that might be associated with the feminine allure of cigarettes in film and advertising of the 1920s, such as Josephine Baker on the left, but instead it sits between the lips in a neutral and therefore unfeminine manner. In Medallion, the marriage portrait of Gluck and Nesta Obermer, I'd say marriage portrait, the couple's heads are defiantly presented in relief, side by side. I'm going to... recalling the power of imperial portraiture, but also the heroic stance of socialist realist art in the 1930s. Gluck's hyper-real style of painting, with its flat surfaces and crisp outlines in paintings such as Lilies, which doesn't seem to be here, was in some ways reflective of a wider return to order in European art of the 1920s and 30s. This is actually Pablo Picasso's source. Following the First World War, many modern artists retreated from abstraction, instead adopting traditional forms of representation and quoting from historical paintings and sculpture. For example, Picasso and Fernand Léger abandoned cubist abstraction for paintings of neoclassical nudes. And this return to order also... slides in the wrong order, sorry, this is Lilies by Gluck. Also influenced fashion and design of the period, with French couturiers such as Madame Gray and Madame Vionnet creating gowns inspired by Grecian drapery, which adorned the covers of Vogue magazine, and in turn inspired artists such as Meredith Frampton in this painting of a seated model with the dress probably taken from a design from Vogue. There are perhaps comparisons to be made between the work of Gluck and the Art Deco style of paintings by the Polish artist Tamara Lempicka, who was based in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. Both artists painted fashionable portraits and striking still lifes, but Lempicka, who was known to be bisexual, also produced a significant number of female nudes, something which appears to be largely absent in Gluck's work. However, as with the 1920s and 30s flower paintings by the American artist Georgia O'Keeffe, it would seem that there is a sublimated erotic charge to some of Gluck's flower paintings, which would invite a Freudian interpretation. Gluck gave an indication of being conscious of this when writing to Nesta Obermer about Lords and Ladies, a 1936 painting which is an arrangement of spiky wild white arum lilies against a black background. The artist asked, how can these flowers be female? Anything more male than this prominent feature, I cannot imagine. This comment demonstrates that Gluck was conscious of the gendering of floral still lifes, but also that it was perhaps possible to subvert this. And although the flower paintings are often associated with women artists, Gluck's paintings are curiously hard-edged and artificial. The artist was to write suggestively of lords and ladies that I feel like a bee penetrating them for their sweetness. This aspect of Gluck's work is completely connected to the artist's relationship with the society florist and author Constance Spry, seen here. The relationship between them resulted from an introduction by the interior designer Prudence Morph, who was the wife of the architect of Gluck's Bolton House studio. These are actually some of Constance Spry's arrangements. And this is the studio, the neoclassical studio designed by Morph. And Prudence Morph wrote to Gluck saying that they were sending a mixed bunch of white flowers for the new studio, kind of, I guess, on this, like the example on the right. I've commissioned my friend Mrs. Spry to do it and to ring you up when certain flowers which I have asked for are procurable. She will probably lend you a marble vase to put them in. She often brings her own when she doesn't know people's own vases. I think she has a genius for flowers and you have a genius for paint, so that ought to make for happiness. It sounds like they were being set up, to be honest. But the resulting arrangement was presented in a Warwick vase with twisted handles and was to be the subject of a monumental painting called Chromatic, 1932 on the left, that formed the centrepiece of Gluck's 1932 exhibition at the Fine Arts Society. It has a classical grandeur, in part due to the restraint of the white flowers and the antique style vase, but also due to the neutral background, formal clarity and carefully balanced composition. The flowers are all captured at their prime, giving the painting an idealised timelessness. According to Diana Sahami, for months, each bloom in the arrangement was replaced as it faded, whilst the artist worked on the painting. Spry was to draw out the associations with Dutch still life paintings in her 1934 book, Flower Decoration. And here she says, Gluck's painting of this group exemplifies the delicacy and the strength, the subtleties and the grandeur of white flowers. It is another point of interest to those who admire the paintings of the old Flemish masters, since here we have a modern artist painting flowers in a spacious and decorative manner with the same decorative precision and feeling that characterised the work of these men. However, unlike the Flemish masters, Gluck's flower paintings do not usually function as vanitas or memento mori. Instead, they speak of a search for perfection, an assertion of control over nature and its processes. As such, there are fascinating parallels with Gluck's own life and self-presentation. An exception to this is a painting entitled Nature More, also referred to as the Dead Group, which was composed of dried flowers from the gardens of Gluck's patron, Molly Lady Mount Temple at Broadlands. Whilst the plant forms reflected Spry's view that anything from the hedgerow could provide material for the arrangement, there is no sense of the casual blousiness of meadow flowers, such as those depicted by other British artists of the period, such as David Jones or Winifred Nicholson on the right. Yet the choice of vase reveals careful consideration. It's a painted plaster vase designed by the sculptor Alberto Giacometti for the influential Parisian designer Jean-Michel Frank, whose shop in the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honor was patronised by the likes of Elsa Schiaparelli, who designed the dress in which we saw Lady Mount Temple in Gluck's portrait. It's instructive, I think, to compare Gluck's paintings of Spry's arrangements with the images illustrating Spry's books by photographers working under, I quote, strict direction to produce what has been described as crafted representations of moments long faded, in which they attempted to exclude from the paintings, from the pictures, everything that was not perfect, and to create fixed tableaus of the ineffable, of hope, innocence, beauty, and chastity. Gluck's notes of flower painting reveal how much the artist was influenced by Spry's ideas. Always give your flowers a setting in keeping with their essential characteristics, just as you would a portrait.
Oh no.
If you had a... Do we need to go? It's okay. Right. If you had a queen to paint, you would see that her surroundings were as regal as could be. Flowers have these degree of flamboyancy and simplicity, and to be arbitrary about your setting is to be as stupid and unreceptive as to set a coal heaver in a sitting room. Be very quick at first essentials of character, as much character in a flower, however tiny, as a portrait. Gluck could not be accused of being arbitrary about the setting in which the flower paintings were presented, either in terms of framing or in which the rooms in which they are hung. Gluck designed the Gluck frame in 1932, a white stepped picture frame in which the artist's works were always to subsequently be presented. It enabled integration of the pictures and setting, but also, I think, arguably sets them apart. And very quickly, I will show you, this, for example, is Baldock versus Bell in a frame, and this is the Gluck room at the Fine Arts Society in 1932. It creates this architectural unity. This is the interior of Gluck's Bolton House studio. Very much part of a kind of continuation of the White Room created in the 1930s by Ciri Morn, the wife of the novelist Somerset Maugham. All these elements of Gluck's paintings reveal more than what the artist called the tinge of the period. They are a unique manifestation of art and gender identity in the 20th century Britain. Gluck's determination to create a personal identity and artistic voice that was utterly distinctive led not only to the creation of remarkable images, but also a body of work that both in its separateness and connections to the wider culture of design, interior decoration and gender politics tells us more about the society in which it was created. Thank you.
I've realised I've just changed the title since I sent it. No, this is the right slideshow. I've just changed the title. I forgot. Yeah, it's definitely the right lecture. When we had them kind of half on earlier this morning, that was quite... Because if it's completely dark, I can't see if people are awake or not. So, no, it's... Do the dark one. It's because I think Bree's doing them as well. Yeah, is that okay? That's fine. Yeah. I brought a prop with me because I don't have any jokes in my talks, so I thought I'd bring this to show you as well. So, there. I'll just put Gluck over here while I'm talking. I'll come and get that later. So, when Amy talked to me about working on the project with her, it was primarily around working with the exhibition. And then the book appeared, which is what we're talking about today. And of course, at that point, I was going to write in the book about how we addressed some of the curatorial challenges in the exhibition. Then the book deadline was brought so far ahead, I hadn't done any work on the exhibition and had to invent almost a topic to write about. I'm not a dress historian, I'm not a biographer, I'm an exhibition maker, and so I had to look for what was going to be my subject in relation to Gluck and exhibition making and biography. And I became very interested in the notion of exhibition as biography. I think we're very familiar with biography as a literary form, but obviously it exists in photography, it exists in cinema, it exists musically and choreographically. But I started looking back through the history of exhibitions to find moments of exhibitions that were taking biography or biographic moments as part of their subject. And what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of a historic context about biographic exhibitions, a contemporary context, and then also to look at different categories of a typology of biographic object, which is what I wrote about in the catalogue, and to look particularly at two types of biographic object, the narrative object and a representational object, and look at how we use those to solve some of the problems to do with absence in relation to the exhibition Gluck, Art and Identity. So I'm going to start first with a bit of a historic context, and I've written in big black pen at the top of my notes here, faction. And faction was a term that Diana Vreeland used about her own biography. Diana Vreeland, who was the editor of American Vogue, became the curator of the Costume Institute at the Met. And Diana Vreeland created, I think, one of the first biographic exhibitions, American Women of Style. Now, Vreeland was very loose in constructing her own biography. And when questioned on it, she said, well, you know, it's somewhere between fact and fiction. It's faction. And I think the idea of faction in relation to biography is quite a pertinent term. We've seen with Gluck that there are sometimes contradictory stories about an incident or about a relationship. And this idea of faction, I think, is a way of sometimes filling in gaps that we have in biography, taking something that's between fact and fiction. But Vreeland's exhibition, American Women of Style, looked at the dressed identities of a number of eminent American women and tried to relate them to the impact that they'd had on clothing and dress styles in the States from the turn of the last century through to the mid-century. One of her subjects was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and here you can see a double-page spread from Vreeland's catalogue. On one side you have images of Whitney, and on the other side you have a short, potted biography of each of the subjects. And this is how Whitney was depicted in the exhibition. There you have the portrait of her, which was reproduced in the catalogue, but then you also have a series of fairly exuberantly posed mannequins. In theory, the mannequins are demonstrating outfits and clothing that Whitney wore. In practice, these clothes weren't always available, and Vreeland went through the archives of the Met finding things that were a bit like things that Whitney wore. So here again you get this sense of faction. In Vreeland's mind, there's no question about authenticity because that's not really her concern. Her concern is much more the theatrical. And you've got this sense of biography mixed from fact and fiction. In a contemporary context, it was interesting last year that a number of major museums around the world opened exhibitions that had almost biographic subjects. In slightly before last year, Jacqueline de Riebe, The Art of Style, was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Dalida, who's an Italian performer who was very, very popular in France and in Spain in recent times, was the subject of an exhibition at Palais Gallier in Paris. So here you have the exhibition on Jacqueline de Riebe. Jacqueline de Riebe was a French aristocrat, and to quote the press release, whose originality and elegance established her as one of the most celebrated fashion personas of the 20th century. Peculiarly, once I started looking in more detail at biographic exhibitions, I started looking at how exhibition makers and curators try to interpret the presence of their subject. And I find it quite strange in this image of a group of mannequins wearing Jacqueline de Riebe's clothing that the mannequins are tall, thin and black. Jacqueline de Riebe is certainly not that tall, quite thin, and certainly not black. So there's no attempt here really to recreate de Riebe's physicality. This is the exhibition at Galliera on Dalida, and again it was a mixture of her stage wear and her everyday clothing, giving a picture of her as a performer both off stage and on stage. Now, according to historian Julia Petrov, such exhibitions depict women as, to quote, celebrated for their acts of self-definition through consumption, and women put on display as subjects notable for their shopping habits. This tends to be the direction that most of the biographic fashion exhibitions that I discovered took. They were predominantly of women of elevated social status or elevated cultural status. So de Riebe, an example of elevated social status, and Dalida, to some people, an example of elevated cultural status. There are alternative approaches, but these are few and far between. And the exhibition Street Style, which Amy curated at the V&A, was one of the first major exhibitions in a major institution to take the clothing of, I guess you could call, everyday people. So not to focus on the aristocratic or to focus on the culturally elevated, but to look at the clothing that people might wear in the street and to get first-hand testimony from those people and include it in the exhibition. An exhibition at Liverpool at the Walker Art Gallery was called A Passion for Fashion, a Liverpool Ladies' Wardrobe. And this showed 130 of the 700 items of clothing dated predominantly between 1910 and 1939, that were left by Mrs. Emily Margaret Tyne, a middle-class GP's wife who lived in Liverpool. So again, touching on the clothing more of the everyday than the extraordinary. There are very few, if any, examples of biographic fashion exhibitions that focus on men. The one that I did find was an exhibition at Bath called The Nureyev Style, which looked at the wardrobe, again, off-stage and on-stage, of Rudolf Nureyev. Strangely enough, I can't find any pictures of it, hence we have a blank slide. But that's not unusual when you're doing exhibition research. It's quite difficult sometimes to find any record of the exhibitions that you're engaging with. The degree to which these exhibitions engage with biographic narrative varies. Occasionally you have exhibitions that hint at biography. This was at Les Arts Décoratifs in Paris, and it was called Wardrobes, The Intimate Revealed, from Cléo de Merode. Cléo de Merode was a Parisian socialite who bequeathed quite a large part of her wardrobe to the collection there. And in this image you have clothing of one of the donors to Les Arts Décoratifs, Monsieur Cornelio Cela Sanchez, and they were displayed in the exhibition as wardrobes, to the extent where the clothes were hung on hangers as if to be seen in a wardrobe. There was very little biographic detail given about the donors or the people who'd bequeathed this material, and really this sense of the material hanging in a wardrobe was the only suggestion that you got of it being owned by an individual rather than an institution. The majority of fashion exhibitions recently have been designer monographs. This is an increasing phenomenon in the landscape of exhibiting fashion. And very recently at Les Arts Décoratifs again was the exhibition Christian Dior, Couturier de Rêve. At the entrance to this exhibition there was a large space which was dedicated to a biography of Dior and a biography of the House of Dior. And through text and through images, through moving image photography and through animated images, there was quite a detailed timeline constructed of Dior's personal biography and of the biography of the house. And as I said, this is quite unusual in monographic exhibitions, which rarely engage with the personal biography of the designer. If anyone saw the Dior exhibition, I think this slide communicates more my frustration at the crowds that's prevented you from actually seeing the material. This was pretty representative of the experience all the way through. But this is the space that had all of that biographic information. Some exhibitions, such as Isabella Blow, Fashion Galore, which was at Somerset House, really engage much more deeply with a biographic narrative. And again, one of the first spaces that you encountered in this exhibition had significant information about Isabella Blow's childhood, the years of her adolescence, and also her professional work and her professional years. So as part of the work that I did for Gluck, I looked at what I call a typology of biographic objects. And this was looking at objects in biographic exhibitions, almost separating them from the biographic narrative and looking at their phenomenology, looking at what those objects, almost in isolation, represented or said. And I came across, well, I devised a typology which included the spectacular object, the humble object, the relic, the imprinted object, and the two that I'm going to look at in a little bit more detail today, which are the narrative object and the representational object. If you want to know more about the other objects, buy the book, because that's where the text in detail will be, or is, sorry. So in the narrative object, and the exhibition that I use as an example for this was an exhibition in the former Royal Palace in Antwerp in 2001 called Two Women, or Twee Vrouwen. And it looked at the work of Chanel. There was a small insertion midway through the exhibition looking at Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons, but predominantly the exhibition was about Chanel. And in one of the rooms, which was called the Chamber of Secrets, there were 5 vitrines at table height. And I don't know whether this was a conscious move on behalf of the designers and the curators, but the vitrines themselves were almost to the scale of a woman's body, or of a smaller woman's body as Chanel's body. And inside each of those cases was placed one of what the curators called a Chanel secret. So in one of the cases there was makeup and a tanning lotion. In another case there was a typical Chanel suit turned inside out so that you could see the lining and the chain weights that weight the skirt and the jacket. In another case there was the very typical Chanel quilted handbag. But to represent the fifth secret, which they identified as being the garçon hairstyle, which Chanel, rightly or wrongly, claimed to have been one of the first people to have adopted and to have then influenced the whole of the rest of the Western world in a typical manner. To represent the garçon hairstyle, they didn't use a fashion plate or a photograph of Chanel. Instead, what they did was they constructed an installation in which a long brown tress of hair, a ponytail tied with a white ribbon at the top, was placed with an oversized pair of shears open as if they were just about to cut through. Now, all of the other material in the Chamber of Secrets came from the collection of Maison Chanel. They were borrowed from the couture house. The ponytail and the shears were objects that the curators had imported into the exhibition. So this is where I come up with the idea of a narrative object. So a narrative object is something that can come from outside of the exhibition or outside of the institution, but can play a very important part in representing a key biographic moment in your subject's narrative. So it's about bringing in an object in a way where there's absence. So there's no... You could have represented the garçon hairstyle, as I said, with a wig or with an image, but rather than that, they've imported these narrative objects of the shears and the ponytail to give, I think, a very... visceral's not the right word, but a very physical representation of that act of cutting hair, the revolutionary act of cutting hair. So in Gluck, one of the absences that we felt, and I think a number of the speakers today have touched on this, one of the absences as curators that we felt was the lack of any of Gluck's tailored menswear. It was something that Amy and Martin both expected to see as they looked through what had been given to the museum, but it really wasn't there. And once we'd looked through the collection of the museum and we'd contacted Barbara and had borrowed some objects from her, the items that we had that were really ostensibly masculine or had some feel of masculinity around them was the scarf that had been folded into a cravat, the pair of monk-styled shoes, and this collar box. At first we were thinking of using the monk shoes, but then when the questions arose around the imprint, which although, as Barbara says, they weren't worn out, she wore them very, very carefully, but with those monk shoes, the physicality of Barbara's imprint was very visible. And I felt slightly, maybe overcautiously, that there was something slightly misrepresentative about showing those shoes in an exhibition about Gluck, where people may look at the wear and look at the chamfer on the heel, imagine that that was from Gluck's gate, whereas actually we can't prove that it was. So my focus really went from the shoes to this collar box. And I started... Sorry, I should first say as well that the collar box is full of a collection of Gluck's handkerchiefs. And I was incredibly relieved to find earlier this morning when I spoke to Barbara that those handkerchiefs were in that box when it was bought from the jumble sale. So the box wasn't just something that was owned by Gluck, it was something that she used to contain these handkerchiefs, which are an object that's very close and very intimate to the body. I slightly obsessed about the collar box as being this point of contact that we had, a piece of material cultural contact that we had that would stand in for Gluck's dressed masculinity. And I suppose through many conversations with Amy and Martin, trying to solve this problem of how do we address this lack of masculine tailoring. And going through all of the research that we could find, the research that I'm sure all of the other writers and curators here found about Gluck, it really became evident to me that while many writers had written about and engaged with what Gluck wore, very few had really engaged with what she'd rejected. And I became fascinated by what I call that point of choice. And through Gluck's life, and I think a major point in her biography, is that point where Gluck chose to reject conventional women's wear. And, again, Amy and Martin have both touched on this, that we're now familiar with what Gluck wore, even though we're less familiar with the sensation that it may have caused. But what Gluck didn't wear were these dresses that quite often revealed significant proportion of the woman's body in a way that it hadn't been revealed before. So not only revealing the leg, but also revealing the arm, revealing the neck, and revealing the throat to quite a significant degree. These clothing, and this, I should say, this is a dress that's in Brighton, which was given by Martin Battersby. It's a typical late 1920s dress, very elaborate evening dress, but quite typical of a dress that a woman of Gluck's class and wealth may have worn. This clothing, this conventional feminine clothing of the time, also quite often positions the woman as a decorative object. And I think we can see from the images that we have of Gluck, not only did she try to hide her body, but there's very little decorative effect around the menswear that she then assumes. So I suppose our narrative became this articulation of Gluck's masculinity through one of the few material objects that we have that represents it, of the collar box, and this narrative object, the imported object of the dress, that we use to, I guess, represent the hyper-femininity of late 1920s fashion. You can see here on the left-hand side a rendering of this concept that I did for the book, way ahead of the installation, and you can see the larger image is that case being installed in the exhibition. So I think once we thought through those ideas, the image of it was very clear in my mind, that the dress should appear not on a mannequin as a seductive object, but the dress should appear flat, almost as if it's been discarded. So again, representing symbolically that act of rejecting feminine clothing. The collar box hovers above the dress and casts a shadow down onto it. And again, trying to get across in a very visual way that point of choice, the point of articulating identity through the rejection of the feminine and the adoption of the masculine. So the dress in this instance is our narrative object, and the composition of the dress on the collar box becomes, I guess, that statement that tries to re-articulate the absent menswear. And there's the dress on the collar box in the exhibition, juxtaposed with a text that was taken from some of the news clippings that we've seen earlier, of, I think, the 1926 news clippings where Gluck talks about how, now that she's experienced the freedom of menswear, she won't go back to wearing women's clothing. Right. See, if I'd been first, I wouldn't have been able to do that, but I've learned from everyone else as we've gone through. And now it looks like I'm really technologically advanced, but I'm not, seriously. Moving on to the idea of the representational object, and what I talked about in terms of this is that it's an object that is almost unmistakably identified as belonging to someone's dressed appearance. So I think a good example of this is Karl Lagerfeld's ponytail. I think Karl Lagerfeld used the ponytail, the fan, and the sunglasses as objects to construct an identity. And when Karl turned into the kind of cartoon Karl towards the end of the last century, it's that silhouette with the ponytail that's instantly recognizable as Lagerfeld. And exhibitions variably engage with these representational objects. So this is Iris Apfel, the nonagenarian style icon, who was the subject of an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And in the exhibition, they transplanted the oversized round glasses that Iris is very well known for onto some of the mannequins. So people who were aware of Iris and her dressed appearance immediately had this sense of Iris's presence in the exhibition. The representational object, I think, can go beyond physical objects. I think it can also be represented through stance, through gesture, through grooming, even through sound. And this is an exhibition that was at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York of the wardrobe of the heiress and muse Daphne Guinness. And in this exhibition, again, they've tried to present Daphne Guinness's presence by using wigs on some of the mannequins that really recreate Guinness's characteristic black and white streaked hairstyle. Again, going back to the exhibition of Isabella Blow was renowned for having a smudge or a smear of quite bright red lipstick. It became one of her characteristic signifiers. I think quite often there are comments about the lipstick going onto her teeth and people having to let her know that before she went on TV and did an interview there was lipstick on her teeth. And this signifier was continued through into the exhibition. So even in quite abstract forms, where the mannequin is covered in a black silk or a black jersey, there's a smear of a metallic red lipstick, again, so that you get that symbolic, that visual symbol that represents Blow, represents her person in the exhibition. And the last example is an exhibition called Simonetta, La Prima Donna della Moda Italiana, which was curated by my colleague Judith Clark. And this exhibition explored the designs of Simonetta di Cesaro, who's one of the leading Rome-based designers of the 1950s and 60s. And Simonetta, again, was very much identified by gesture, the gesture with the cigarette, the hand held aloft, the wrist curved, the cigarette held in the fingers. And it's interesting that a number of times through the talks today, that sense of the cigarette and the gesture have been quite important. And here is someone who was renowned for that gesture. And Judith very cleverly used almost disembodied hands floating in front of the mannequins in this exhibition to render Simonetta visible through recreation of that gesture. So, for Gluck, looking for a representational object, it seemed that almost the most representational or the most representative item or part of Gluck's dressed appearance was this very well-constructed image that she presented quite often to photographers, but also in portraits. So here we have three images of Gluck, which I think we're all very well familiar with by now. And here the further two, the Costa and the Angus MacBain. And of course, this image of the profile is an image presented through medallion. But also we find that Gluck uses this profile even in informal images. So images of her in Bolton House or in the countryside, again presents her face in profile. So through quite a lot of reflection on the image that Gluck presented and kind of visual analysis of this image, particularly of the head, what I identified were, I guess, three component parts of the construction of this image. The first one is to present in profile. The second one, I think even more importantly, is the downward gaze. So that Gluck adopts the profile, but she also adopts a downward gaze. There's a slight tilt of the head, there's a half shielding of the eye, and her eye is focusing downwards, which I think gives an incredibly reflective sense to the image. And of course, the third component, I think, is the sculpting of the hair. So with these three components in mind, I went along to the Digital Anthropology Lab at London College of Fashion, who I've worked with before, and these are people who are really leading in digital technologies of printing, scanning, reproduction. And I talked to Holly Shaw, who's one of the technicians at Digital Anthropology, about what we might be able to do in terms of representing Gluck in the exhibition, using this idea of the three components of the profile, the downward gaze, and the hair. I also took along some images of Art Deco sculpture and Art Deco decorative arts, looking at sculptural renditions of the body. This is slightly earlier. This is by Antoine Bourdelle, the French sculptor who did the frieze around the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. This is taken from that. But using I guess, sculpture contemporary to Gluck and the photographs of Gluck with the identification of those three components, that was my brief to Holly. And the idea was that we'd construct some kind of prosthetic that would sit on a mannequin within the exhibition. I'd imagined that in the way that this image is frieze-like, I'd imagined that what we might create as the representational object for Gluck may also be frieze-like. But foolishly, I went on holiday for 2 weeks, and when I came back, Holly had started work, and had started to produce quite an extraordinary three-dimensional rendering of Gluck's head. Now, the aim, I've got to say, wasn't to give an absolutely lifelike representation, which is why I used the images of the sculpture and the decorative arts. We were looking for something that was slightly more stylized, but that had, I guess, those distinguishing features of Gluck's appearance that people might recognize. So I won't go into the process in detail, but I do want to say that what was extraordinary about this process is that it is a sculpting process, even though it happens on screen. So in the center, you can see Holly's hand with this articulated arm. And unlike sculpture where you're working with clay or with plaster, where you have a direct contact with your hands on the material, working digitally to sculpt, Holly worked with a generic female head, and then you use the stylus. Well, you're looking at the head on screen, the stylus is over here somewhere, but as you move the stylus, you can feel it coming up against the block of clay that you see on screen. It's a particularly, if you've not done it before, it's a particularly disorientating thing, and I think it's extraordinary that Holly was able to get that kind of synchronicity between eye and hand to sculpt. There was a few processes of refining, particularly the lips and the forehead for Gluck. And then the idea of sculpting the hair, and sculpting the hair in quite a stylized way. We left a slightly jagged opening down the back of the head because I thought it was very important that when people saw this head in the exhibition, it was very clear that our intention wasn't to create something like lifelike. So we've left, I'll show you in the actual one. So we left, through the stylized rendering of the hair, we left this kind of slightly jagged gap down the center back of the head. The head was printed. There were three possible options for printing. One was too expensive. One, you couldn't print to that scale. So we went for a printing process, which is quite a new 3D printing process using plaster. The plaster is impregnated with cyanoacrylate, which is basically a superglue, and that creates quite a robust but very beautifully textured material, which is this is the prototype that I have here. So I'll just show you quickly. This is the prototype. Well, this is the finished head. The prototype, strangely, because neither Holly nor myself had ever done this process before. When we did the first print, it was comically too large, and I worked out that it's actually 16.7% too large, and so we had to reprint a second edition, and we scaled it down by 16.7%. And that sits on top of the mannequin, which is wearing Gluck's smock and wearing Gluck's cravat. And that's the head installed in the exhibition. There it is in front of the collection of floral dresses. And I think I'm probably run out of time, so that's the end of that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's been a wonderful final session for the lectures. So, Simon, would you help, please? And we have to use the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
But if you take it, because you might have questions. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Simon or Jeff before tea?
I think before tea was the important bit then, wasn't it? You can ask us after tea.
During tea. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, they were both really, really interesting. Comprehensive.
Thank you.
Okay, well, if we haven't got questions in a formal context, why don't we all go and have tea and you can talk to Simon and Jeff more informally. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.